Hello and welcome back to Shoogly Shed Motors. Been a little bit of a break there. I was away for a week on holiday, but I am now back and I want to get this engine finally finished. As I showed you in the end of the last episode, we got the cylinder back from the machine shop, all rebored. I have since given it a blast and a paint to match the rest of the engine. So this is all ready to go. So without further ado, let's do it. Let's get this engine finished, finally. Right, I've got my +1 piston here. It's a brand new piston, comes with piston rings. I've shown this trick I think before. Yes, you can use piston ring pliers. It's probably the best way to get piston rings onto a piston. I do have a set of them, but I found them quite fiddly. Maybe they work better on car pistons, I don't know. But I find that this way works quite well for me. So this is my second ring. So my second down. What I do is you put the ring into it like that, lift the other end over the piston and rotate the ring round like that, work it down the piston into its groove. Very simple. The risk here is that you score the edge of the piston as the ring edge comes down. You just need to take care as that edge comes over it not to let that happen. But just to show you again, you go like that, lift the opposing edge over the top of the piston, push it round. Like I said, just guide the end of that ring over the top of the piston as it comes down so as not to scratch it, and it's in. It's very simple, neat little trick. People can really make a bit of a mess of trying to get piston rings onto a piston, scratching the piston or breaking rings. So that's just a little handy tip that I spotted it online somewhere actually, and I adopted it for my methods, and it works pretty well. Other thing to note about piston rings is you want to basically point these gaps, the end gaps of the piston rings here, opposing each other. So one end gap on one side and the other on the other. It just basically helps increase compression. If the gap are basically in the same place, you'll probably lose compression through that gap. Despite the fact it's like very tiny gap, it's still enough to lose a bit of compression and the engine won't run as well as it could. The other thing I did off camera was I got these rings and checked the end gaps in position. So I showed this in other videos before as well. If you go back to my XJR 1300 engine build, you'll see it, where basically you put the piston ring itself into the barrel of the piston and you measure the gap between the two ends of the piston ring. It gives you specs for this in the Haynes manual or most workshop manuals. That's just to ensure that as the engine expands, there's enough space basically for those rings to expand and not hit each other and then seize up the engine or worse. Well, I don't know what's worse than seizing an engine, but you know what I mean. So that's obviously another critical step to have taken. I've already done that, so I'm happy to proceed now that this piston is ready to go onto the conrod. So the gudgeon pin can be slid out just enough to allow it to go over the conrod. I like to put a little bit of assembly loop on the gudgeon pin just to ease that and help it. And then I'll also put some in the connecting rod end, smear it around a little bit. Now this piston, like a lot of pistons, has an in mark on it. I don't know if that'll show up on camera, but basically that means that that side is the intake side of the engine. So we just place this over and then like that. I like to just rock it back and forward to spread that oil. So now with the piston on the connecting rod, we'll fit 2 new circlips that will retain it. They're just little single strand circlips, and it's a bit fiddly, but they go in either end of the piston, the gudgeon pin I should say. Here we go, there's one in, and then using a little tool I rotate the circlip round so that the gap in the circlip is away from the installation gap on the piston, and we'll do the same on the other side. Now I've not done it here, but it's probably wise if this is your first time doing this, is to stuff a rag or something around the piston into the cam chain tunnel, etc. as well, to stop that circlip dropping down into the engine if you drop it, and that can happen because, like I said, it is quite fiddly, so it might be prudent to do that. I've managed it without it, but like I say, I've done it a few times. Right, next thing I'm going to do, and this is probably controversial and I can foresee the comments already, I put a smear of this, it's Loctite MR5922, it's a flange sealant is what they call it, but basically it's a non-hardening gasket, gasket compound. What I do is I smear it around the base of the cylinder and the sort of mating surface here on the top of the crankcase, before I put the gasket on as well, and I also use it on the head gasket as well. I know that a lot of manuals and things will say that these gaskets should be fitted dry with no sealant. Usually that's basically warding you off the temptation to use like a silicone hardening sealant, whereas this stuff, like I say, doesn't harden, it's resin based, and it's probably not 100% necessary in most cases, but if you have an old engine like this, it can maybe just catch a tiny leak that may have otherwise happened in a gasket surface, like a head gasket. Again, I don't know if it's entirely necessary, but I've used it on every engine build I've done so far. Never had any negative effects, and I've never had the head gasket issue, so maybe it's working, maybe it's not necessary, I don't know. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it, so I'm sticking with my methods. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong. There's also a little oil, I'm not sure what it is, sort of oil feed regulator pressure little insert pipe thing that goes into the crankcase here. Just looks like a little aluminium pipe with a few holes in it. I've already popped that in there, so if you're following along this video for purposes of your own engine build, don't omit that pipe, it's quite important. The other thing that is very important not to omit is a fresh O-ring. Some engines have these, some don't. This one does. But the O-ring basically sits in a groove between the barrel and the casting. We'll just sit that into there, it'll push down into that gap. Okay, what I'm doing now is just really well lubricating the piston rings with assembly oil. You don't really need to use assembly oil as such. Fresh engine oil should really also work just fine, but this stuff is nice and tacky, so it doesn't run quite as quickly as engine oil does. So it doesn't make quite as much of a mess. You know, I'm not done. With the feckin' base gasket on, did I? I'm sure there were people screaming at their computers. You've not put the gasket on! And then I'm just going to lift the cam chain up as well through the tunnel. Keep it nice and taut just as I seat the barrel home. Make sure the dowels are lining up. Like that. So at this point I've got 2 bolts to go in here that basically retain the barrel onto the crankcase. Now I've got 2 bolts with sort of sharpened points and copper washers, and these, there's one that goes through the barrel and one that goes through the cylinder head, and they go into the cam chain tensioner. So get the first one in, you kind of have to lift the cam chain tensioner a bit to locate the hole. There we go. That's the cam chain tensioner in place. What I've also done is I've pushed the cam chain tensioner right down and put a little pin, a 2mm pin, through a hole that is drilled into it for this exact purpose, which keeps the tension off the tensioner currently until we've got basically everything assembled. We'll take that pin out and the tension should be set on the chain, but that's a good thing to do just now. Right, I'm going to get in about this with my flange sealant again. We've now got dowels to fit in the top. There's 3 of them. And this rear dowel here gets an O-ring seal over the top of it. Slid into place like that. Now let's not omit the gasket. We go on that way. So we also have now this cam chain guide, which will slide down. Conveniently won't go past the blooming gasket. Okay, there's a little bucket in the casting here that you need to make sure that the end of this guide goes into that little bucket, and it should then be more or less in contact with the cam chain. Acts like a guide, but that is effectively in place now, and then we've also sat the head gasket back down. Alright, I'm going to pop a bit of wire through my cam chain, which will make it easier to lift. Now, a bit of a tricky operation here, but I'm going to pass that wire through the hole in the cylinder head, and then get everything else through as well. Both cam chain guides and the cam chain tensioner. Now that they're more or less in place, we're going to make sure that the studs in the cylinder head go into their holes. One last little look here. We're happy. And just get it onto the dowels. That's us on the dowels now. Knock it home. So that's our cylinder head back on. Got the wire, cam chain guides where it should be. All looking hunky-dory. Right, so now we fit the cylinder head bolts. We've got two long ones that go on the right hand side of the engine, sort of on the inside, and then two shorter ones that go on the left hand side of the engine on the outside. There's copper washers that go on the outside ones. So my big head bolts are to go to 36 Newton meters. There we go. With them tight, I've got nuts to put on the studs, and they go to, I think it was 25 Newton meters. Right, I don't have a torque wrench adapter for a ring spanner or a spanner to get into these nuts, but basically what I'm doing is just making them FT. Roughly about the same, or a little less than the the cylinder head bolts. That should suffice really. So now I'm tightening the other cam chain tensioner bolt, which goes through the barrel this time. They're quite soft threads, so no need to over tighten them. Okay, the last thing to do is to fit the cam chain onto the camshaft and get the top onto the engine with the rockers. Side covers on. Yeah, nearly there. So first things first, plenty of assembly lube on these bearing surfaces. You can also use is it moly grease, moly bendum something grease. These are prone to oil starvation, so it's prudent to use the proper stuff, especially for a dry startup. Slide the camshaft in, world's tiniest camshaft, and then we'll get the chain out the way. Now that this is in position, I'm going to take this wire out because it's only going to get in my way now. Like this, set the camshaft down in its journal, just giving it a little spin round to spread some of that lubricant. Right, in order to time the engine, I've just temporarily fitted the left-hand crankcase. I've also removed the inspection holes. There's two, a big one and a small one. Basically, the top one has a little notch in it, and on the rotor are timing marks. So I need to align basically the timing marks on the rotor with the notch on the casing, and then that means that the engine's basically in time for the sprocket being fitted to the camshaft. Right, we're in alignment now, so I can now fit the cam chain sprocket. So we're putting the sprocket in, there's two marks on either side there to basically be parallel with the mating surface. So okay, bit fiddly, but that says now sprocket, two marks in line with the gasket surface, cam chain's on. So now I need to rotate the camshaft. So we're to arrange the camshaft in roughly the 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock position for the lobes. So I'm going to say that that is that way round. So looking at it from this angle, this lobe is pointing roughly 8 o'clock and the back lobe is pointing roughly 4 o'clock. And that basically means that the engine isn't 180 degrees out, if that makes sense. So with that, like that, the next thing to do is there's a bolt to go in, then we'll spin the engine 180 degrees and put the other one in. And the manual doesn't call for this, but I always put Loctite on these bolts because of the absolute catastrophe it would be if they came out. It's up to you whether you want to or not. Let's put one in first, and then we'll spin the engine round 180 degrees and put the other one in. So now I'm going to take the pin out that I put in the tensioner, and it should tension, he hopes, like that. So this is an automatic tensioner. Basically, as the chain wears, the wedge here will travel up, and this one will travel down and take up any slack in the chain. So just having a wee feel at the chain where it's exposed at the bottom, and up here feels nice and solid. So that's good progress. The engine's in time, the camshaft's fitted. Next, and kind of last thing to do for the top end anyway, is to fit the rocker cover with the rockers. Okay, this time we're going to use a silicone sealer, not my jointing compound. It's quite important not to get it anywhere near the camshaft journals, just because this engine obviously, like I've said a couple of times, does suffer from poor lubrication at times, so don't get them in there. And then also any oil galleries, etc. This stuff can cause havoc. So a little tip is to apply it on the kind of outer half of the surface edge, if that makes sense. And that way when the rocker cover is tightened down, it pushes any excess out of the head and not inside, where this well, where it would harden and cause issues in the oilways, etc. I've also got this little bung, which is basically a rev counter delete bung. I'm going to use a digital rev counter off the coil pack, so I don't need the mechanical one. So that bung goes in now with a little bit of sealant on it to stop it leaking. Yeah, next thing is the dowels, and then the top goes on. Last thing is to lubricate all the valves with clean engine oil. Plenty of it. If this is your first engine build, or you've never done it before, you have to remember when you start that engine for the first time, oil takes a few seconds to build up pressure and to start circulating around the engine. And the last place your oil gets to in your engine is your cylinder head. So you want to give it as best chance as you can of not crapping itself upon startup. Plenty of oil over my camshaft. You put over my cam chain for good measure. Why not? Now we're ready to fit the rocker cover. I've also slackened off the adjusters, like the valve gap adjusters, just because I'll be able to adjust the gaps once the engine's once this is all bolted down basically. So I don't really need to have them getting in the way. So let's place that over the dowels. So that's now down, and then we've got bolts to go in the top. 3 of them take copper washers. I'll show you which ones those are. So this is the decompression assembly, and there is a bracket that basically goes onto this part of the head, and that's for the cable to go to that. So between that bracket and its securing bolt, we're fitting a copper washer, like so. And then we've also got a copper washer on the one immediately back from it. And the last one that takes a copper washer is the bolt that goes through the rocker shaft at the front of the engine, in there. So we get these screwed down, get the rest of them in, get them all torqued up. Right, so valve gaps. The inlets are to be 0.05 mil and the exhausts to be 0.1. So what we'll do is we'll slide my feeler gauge between the top of the valve and the adjuster screw, and then we'll tighten down the lock bolt like that. Just double check that clearance, which is good. So with this one, same idea. Slide my feeler gauge under, tighten down onto it, tighten the lock nut, so that's my exhaust gaps done and my inlet's done. The exhaust one is always just slightly bigger because the exhaust side just gets ever so slightly more hot, especially on an air cooled engine like this one. So to finish off the top end, I'm just going to fit the valve adjustment covers with fresh O-rings. And these just get bolted on like that. So the last piece of the puzzle is fitting the side casings. What I like to do is put a smear of silicone sealant along the edge of the casing and then basically stick the paper gasket to it, and that basically should hopefully mean that in future, if you ever have to take the casing off for whatever reason, you can preserve your gasket basically, because it will be stuck to the casing. I'm going to put my pickup on. This is the ignition pickup. I'm just double checking that the clutch release pin is there, because it has a tendency to fall out. One last little look at this side of the engine. No muck in there. All right. So, like many times before, I'm using copper grease on the casing bolts because these are stainless steel replacements, and stainless steel has a habit of seizing into aluminium cases. We don't want that happening. The last pieces of the puzzle is these inspection hole bungs with a couple of fresh O-rings. That is that. Well, that's the engine finished. It's obviously taken a lot longer than I intended. This engine has thrown up quite a few challenges. Obviously, we wrote it off more or less when we stripped it down, but you know, getting that big job lot of spare parts really saved my bacon and that. I don't think I've used as many helicoils in a single engine ever. I think this engine's been rebuilt or repaired or something by someone in the past, possibly Hercules or the Hulk, one of the two. But either way, so many stripped threads or nearly stripped threads or rounded off things, seized things. Engines like this, just because of the age they are, I suppose they can have been through a few different owners with slightly dubious service history, but I can be confident now that it's been through with a fine tooth comb. Everything is what it should be now, and it's good to go back into the bike. Obviously we got everything set up last time to get that rolling chassis together, and I also have the forks back from chroming from Philpotts. So AM Philpotts hard chrome have re-chromed my forks. I've got the lowers from the powder coater as well, and I've got oil and seals. So probably in the next episode what we'll do is we'll get the forks together, get them on the bike, and get the engine into the frame. Yeah, then a sort of rolling chassis is more or less achieved, and we can just keep ticking away with other stuff. Getting this engine done was really a massive kind of weight off my shoulders, just because I know how many issues I was having with it, and it was starting to really stress me out a little bit. But we got there in the end. I knew we would, but it was a challenge. Anyway, as usual, please do give me a like, leave me a comment, and make sure you subscribe to the Shoogly Shed channel. I will see you next time. Take care. Goodbye. So, like many times before, I've been interrupted by a fire call.